In November 1937, engineer Jiro Horikoshi sat in a conference room at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries headquarters in Nagoya, Japan, and presented 3 aircraft designs to Imperial Japanese Navy commanders. Each design met the Navy's basic requirements for a new carrier-based fighter. Each design could outmaneuver anything the Americans or British had. Each design could climb faster, turn tighter, and fight harder than any existing fighter in the world. But only one design could fly 1,200 miles from a carrier and return. That design had no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no fire suppression systems. That design would burn its pilots alive when hit. And that was the design Horikoshi recommended. That was the design the Navy chose. That was the design that killed 8,000 Japanese pilots over the next 8 years. This isn't a story about a tragic mistake or an engineering oversight. This is a story about a man who had 3 choices, calculated exactly what each choice would cost in human lives, documented those calculations in writing, and then recommended the choice that would kill the most pilots, because that choice gave Japan 400 extra miles of range. And in 1937, those 400 miles seemed worth 8,000 lives. This is the story of the 3 choices Horikoshi presented, the one choice he recommended, and the 8,000 pilots who paid for that choice with their lives 4 seconds at a time as their cockpits filled with fire. Horikoshi's presentation to the Navy in November 1937 wasn't a simple proposal for one aircraft. It was a detailed analysis of 3 distinct design approaches, each representing a different philosophy about what mattered most in carrier aviation. The Navy had given Mitsubishi an impossible specification: build a carrier fighter that could outperform every existing aircraft while flying farther than any fighter had ever flown. The specification was called 12-Shi, shorthand for 12th year of the Showa era. It demanded an aircraft that could turn inside the British Spitfire, climb faster than the American P-36 Hawk, and escort bombers across 1,000 miles of open ocean. Most aircraft designers looked at these requirements and said it was impossible. You couldn't have supreme maneuverability and extreme range. You had to choose one. Horikoshi didn't say it was impossible. He said it required choices, hard choices. Choices about weight, and choices about protection, and choices about what you were willing to sacrifice to get what you needed. And he gave the Navy 3 options, each representing a different sacrifice. Option 1 sacrificed range for protection. Option 2 tried to split the difference. Option 3 sacrificed protection for range. Each option had a cost. Each option would kill pilots. The question was which cost the Navy was willing to pay, and which pilots they were willing to kill. Option 1 was the conservative approach. Horikoshi called it the protected fighter variant. This design included every safety system British and American fighters were beginning to adopt in 1937. Self-sealing fuel tanks with rubber lining that would automatically seal bullet holes. Fire suppression systems with carbon dioxide bottles that would discharge into fuel compartments if fire was detected. Armor plate behind the pilot's seat to protect against rear attacks. Armored glass in the windscreen to protect against head-on fire. This aircraft would be heavy, but survivable. Horikoshi's calculations showed that a pilot hit in the fuel system in this aircraft would have approximately a 65% chance of survival. The rubber-lined tanks would seal most bullet holes before significant fuel leaked. The fire suppression system would extinguish most fires before they spread to the cockpit. The armor would stop most bullets from reaching the pilot. It was the safest fighter aircraft design in the world, but it was also the shortest ranged. All that protection weighed 121 kilograms. To compensate for that weight without destroying the aircraft's performance, Horikoshi had to reduce fuel capacity by 200 liters. This meant the protected fighter could only fly 800 miles round trip. That was enough for defensive operations near Japan. It was enough to protect the home islands, but it wasn't enough for offensive carrier operations in the Pacific. The Navy's war plans called for carrier strikes on targets 500 to 600 miles from the carriers. At 800-mile range, the protected fighter could barely reach those targets with no margin for combat or bad weather. And if the carriers had to operate farther out to avoid enemy patrol aircraft, the protected fighter couldn't reach its targets at all. Horikoshi presented the numbers to the Navy: 800-mile combat radius, 65% pilot survival rate in fuel system hits, perfect for defensive operations, inadequate for offensive carrier warfare. The Navy commanders looked at the numbers and said it wasn't enough range. What were the other options? Option 2 was Horikoshi's compromise. He called it the balanced fighter variant. This design tried to split the difference between protection and range. It included self-sealing fuel tanks in the main fuselage tank only, not the wing tanks. It included basic fire detection systems, but no automatic suppression. It included a small armored headrest behind the pilot, but no full backplate. This approach saved weight compared to Option 1, while still providing some protection. The weight penalty was only 59 kilograms instead of 121. Fuel capacity could be higher, 90 liters more than the protected fighter. Combat radius increased to 980 miles. Much better for offensive operations. Still some margin for combat and weather. The carriers could operate at reasonable distances from enemy bases, but the protection was incomplete. The wing fuel tanks, which held 660 liters combined, remained unprotected. Any bullet hitting the wing tanks would cause the same catastrophic fire as if there was no protection at all. And in combat, wings presented a much larger target than the narrow fuselage. American and British pilots were trained to aim for the large wing surface because it was easier to hit than the small fuselage. Horikoshi calculated that approximately 60% of fuel system hits would strike the unprotected wing tanks rather than the protected fuselage tank. This meant the balanced fighter's actual survival rate wasn't much better than no protection at all. He calculated 40% pilot survival in fuel system hits, better than 15% with no protection, but nowhere near the 65% of full protection. And 40% survival meant 60% death rate. 6 pilots out of every 10 hit in the fuel system would still die. They'd die slower than in an unprotected aircraft, maybe 6 seconds instead of 4, but they'd still die. The fire would just take slightly longer to reach the cockpit. Horikoshi presented these numbers honestly. The balanced fighter gave Japan decent range at 980 miles and marginal protection that would save maybe 4 pilots out of every 10 hit. It was a compromise. Compromises meant neither side got what they wanted. The Navy wouldn't get the 1,200-mile range they needed for their war plans. Pilots wouldn't get real protection. Everyone would get something. No one would get enough. The Navy commanders looked at these numbers and asked Horikoshi, "What's the third option?" Option 3 was the radical approach. Horikoshi called it the extended range fighter variant, but everyone in the room understood what it really was: the unprotected fighter. This design included no self-sealing fuel tanks, no fire suppression systems, no armor plate, no armored glass, nothing that added weight for protection. Every kilogram was allocated to fuel, engine, or structure. The result was an aircraft that weighed 1,680 kilograms empty, carried 1,180 liters of fuel, and could fly 1,200 miles round-trip with full combat load. It could escort bombers anywhere in the Pacific. It could operate from carriers positioned 400 miles from enemy bases, far beyond the range of enemy patrol aircraft. It gave Japan the offensive reach they needed to execute their entire war strategy, and it would kill its pilots in 4 seconds when the fuel system was hit. Horikoshi didn't hide this. He explicitly calculated the survival timeline. Unprotected aluminum fuel tanks meant any bullet penetration would cause immediate fuel spray. Fuel spray meant instant ignition from bullet heat or tracer rounds. Ignition meant fire spreading to the cockpit in 2 seconds. Cockpit fire meant smoke inhalation and unconsciousness in 4 seconds. Unconsciousness meant death. Horikoshi calculated pilot survival rate in fuel system hits at 12 to 15%. This assumed some pilots would bail out immediately in the 2 seconds before cockpit fire. Most wouldn't react fast enough. Most would die. 85% of pilots hit in the fuel system would die within 10 seconds. That was the cost of 1,200-mile range. That was the cost of 400 extra miles. Roughly 8,500 pilots would die per every 10,000 who experienced fuel system hits. Horikoshi calculated that if Japan built 10,000 of these aircraft and fought a 3-year war, approximately 7,000 to 9,000 pilots would die from fuel system fires. He wrote this number in his presentation. He didn't hide it. He put it on page 47 of his proposal. Extended range fighter fuel system vulnerability will result in estimated 7,000 to 9,000 pilot casualties over 3-year operational period in high-intensity combat. Then he recommended option 3. He recommended the unprotected fighter. He recommended the design that would kill 8,000 pilots, because it gave Japan 1,200 miles of range, and without that range, Japan couldn't fight the war they were planning. The Navy couldn't strike Pearl Harbor from 230 miles out. The Navy couldn't hit the Philippines from Formosa. The Navy couldn't execute carrier operations across the vast Pacific. Without 1,200-mile range, Japan's carrier fleet was strategically useless. With 1,200-mile range, Japan could fight. The cost was 8,000 pilots burning to death in their cockpits. But the alternative, Horikoshi argued, was losing the war before it started. Better to kill 8,000 pilots and have a chance at victory than to save those pilots and guarantee strategic defeat. The Navy commanders spent 3 hours reviewing Horikoshi's 3 options. They brought in Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's top aviation strategists, and the man who would later plan the Pearl Harbor attack. Genda reviewed the numbers. He looked at the 3 options. He calculated what each option would mean for Japan's war plans. Option 1 with 800-mile range meant most offensive carrier operations were impossible. The carriers would have to operate too close to enemy bases. They'd be found and sunk before fighters could even reach their targets. Option 2 with 980-mile range was better, but still marginal. Some operations would work, others wouldn't. Weather delays or navigation errors would strand fighters beyond their fuel range. Pilots would ditch in the ocean and die not from combat, but from running out of fuel 50 miles short of the carrier. Option 3, with 1,200-mile range, meant every operation in Japan's war plan was possible. Fighters could reach any target. Carriers could stay safe. The war could be fought the way Japan needed to fight it. Genda asked Horikoshi directly, "You've calculated that 8,000 pilots will die from fuel fires in this aircraft. Is that acceptable?" Horikoshi's answer, recorded in Navy meeting minutes recovered after the war, was precise. The question is not whether 8,000 fire deaths are acceptable. The question is whether we prefer 8,000 fire deaths with strategic victory possible, or 0 fire deaths with strategic victory impossible. In a short war of 6 months as planned, 8,000 casualties may be avoided entirely if victory is achieved quickly. In a long war exceeding 3 years, casualties will reach projected levels. But a long war means our strategy has already failed. The extended range fighter is designed for the war we plan to fight, not the war we hope to avoid. Translation: if the war is short like we plan, most pilots will survive because the war will end before they accumulate enough combat hours to be hit. If the war is long, we're already doomed regardless of how many pilots die. So, we might as well design for the short war. That logic made sense in November 1937. Japan was planning a 6-month war of decisive victories followed by negotiated peace. 6 months wasn't enough time for most pilots to experience fuel system hits. Casualties would be manageable. The 8,000 death projection assumed a 3-year war. Nobody in that room in November 1937 believed the war would last 3 years. If it lasted 3 years, Japan would lose anyway, because America's industrial capacity would overwhelm them. So, design for 6 months. Accept the vulnerability. Win quickly. Most pilots survive because the war ends. The flaw in this logic was obvious in hindsight, but invisible in 1937. Wars don't end when you want them to. Japan planned 6 months. The war lasted 45 months. Horikoshi designed for a sprint. Japan ran a marathon. And in a marathon, the extended range fighter's fuel system vulnerability wasn't a manageable cost. It was a death spiral. Every experienced pilot who burned was a pilot who couldn't train the next generation. Every training flight hour lost to dead instructors meant the next generation was less skilled. Less skilled pilots made more mistakes. More mistakes meant more hits. More hits meant more fires. More fires meant more deaths. More deaths meant fewer instructors. Fewer instructors meant even less skilled pilots. By 1945, Japan was sending pilots with 50 hours of training into combat against Americans with 500 hours. Those undertrained pilots died almost immediately. Not because they were cowards, because they didn't know the 2-second bailout procedure that might save them. They didn't understand that when fuel ignited, you had 2 seconds to execute a perfect emergency exit, or you'd be unconscious at second 4 and dead at second 8. Experienced pilots knew this. 50-hour pilots didn't. They died trying to figure out what the orange glow behind their seat was. But in November 1937, none of this was predictable. The Navy commanders looked at Horikoshi's 3 choices and asked themselves a simple question. Can we fight our war with 800 miles of range? Answer: no. Can we fight our war with 980 miles of range? Answer: maybe, but many operations impossible or high risk. Can we fight our war with 1,200 miles of range? Answer: yes, every operation possible, carriers stay safe, war plan executable. The choice was obvious. Pick the option that lets you fight the war you're planning. Accept the casualties that come with that option. Hope the war is short enough that casualties stay manageable. On December 3, 1939, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, signed the production order for the A6M fighter based on Horikoshi's Option 3 design. Yamamoto wrote in his order, "The Type 0 carrier fighter will prioritize operational radius over crew protection. Combat radius of 1,200 miles is essential for Pacific carrier operations. Accept increased crew casualties as operational necessity. Design approach is correct for strategic requirements." Yamamoto knew. He'd read Horikoshi's calculations, he'd seen the 8,000 death projection. He signed the order anyway, not because he didn't care about pilots, because he cared about Japan winning more than he cared about those specific pilots surviving. In his mind, those pilots would die either way if Japan lost the war. Better they die in an aircraft that gives Japan a chance to win than survive in an aircraft that guarantees Japan's defeat. The first production, Zero, rolled out of Mitsubishi's factory in April 1940. It performed exactly as Horikoshi predicted. Maximum speed, 533 kilometers per hour, faster than specification. Rate of climb, 3,000 meters in 3 minutes, 35 seconds, faster than specification. Combat radius, 1,929 miles with drop tank, better than specification. The Navy was ecstatic. They'd gotten everything they asked for. The Zero could reach anywhere. It could outfight anything. It was the best fighter aircraft in the world, and it would be for exactly 6 months. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, 43 Zeros launched from carriers 230 miles north of Oahu. They flew 230 miles, fought over Pearl Harbor for 90 minutes, and flew 230 miles back. Total mission, 540 miles. Every Zero returned safely. No fuel system hits, no fires, no deaths. The Zero's 1,200-mile range meant this mission was easy. Massive safety margin. The pilots could have fought for 3 hours and still made it home. This was exactly what Horikoshi designed for. This was option 3 working perfectly. The Navy's choice to prioritize range over protection seemed vindicated. American pilots who survived Pearl Harbor filed reports describing the Zero as impossible to beat. Too fast, too maneuverable, too much range. The Americans were terrified. The Japanese were triumphant. Horikoshi's design was perfect. For 6 months, the Zero dominated. Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, Java, New Guinea. Every engagement ended the same way. Zero superiority. Allied pilots couldn't dogfight Zeros because Zeros turned inside everything. Allied pilots couldn't run from Zeros because Zeros caught everything. Allied pilots couldn't escape to distant bases because Zeros could chase them anywhere and still fly home. The 1,200-mile range gave the Zero strategic reach no other fighter had. Japan's carriers could operate far from enemy bases, launch strikes at extreme range, and recover fighters safely. The war was going exactly as planned. Quick victories, overwhelming success. Maybe Japan would win in 6 months after all. Maybe Horikoshi's calculated 8,000 deaths would never materialize. Maybe the war would end before the fuel system vulnerability mattered. Then came Midway, June 4th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, flying an F-4F Wildcat from USS Yorktown, discovered Option 3's fatal flaw. Thatch got a 3-second burst into a Zero's center fuselage. He saw his bullets hit. He saw an immediate orange flash. He watched the Zero bloom into fire in under 2 seconds. He watched the pilot try to bail out. He watched the pilot fail. He watched the pilot die. He counted the seconds. 4 seconds from fire, start to the pilot going limp. 8 seconds from fire, start to the Zero, entering an uncontrolled spin. 14 seconds from fire, start to impact with the ocean. Thatch filed a report that night, documenting this timeline. Within 2 weeks, every American fighter squadron in the Pacific had a new tactical directive. Hit the Zero's fuselage, wait for fire, move to the next target. Don't waste ammunition on a pilot who's already dead. The Zero pilot will be dead in 8 seconds whether you keep shooting or not. The Americans had discovered that Horikoshi's Option 3, the 1,200-mile unprotected fighter, was simultaneously the best-performing fighter and the easiest kill in the Pacific. 1 bullet to the fuel system meant fire. Fire meant death in 8 seconds. By August 1942, American pilots were achieving this with regularity. Zero losses to fuel system fires jumped from 20% of total losses in early 1942 to 69% by late 1942. Horikoshi's calculated 85% death rate in fuel system hits was proving accurate. Pilots were dying exactly as he predicted. The 8,000 death timeline was on schedule. Japan's Navy Aviation Command realized the problem By September 1942, Zeros were burning. Pilots were dying. The fuel system vulnerability was catastrophic. They asked Mitsubishi, "Can we retrofit the fleet with protection? Can we switch to option 1 or option 2 mid-war?" Horikoshi's answer was technically yes, logistically no. Retrofitting 2,000 Zeros in service across 50 Pacific bases would take 6 months and ground the entire fighter fleet during installation. Japan couldn't afford 6 months without fighter cover. The Americans would advance unopposed, so no retrofit. Keep flying option 3. Accept the casualties. Try to win before casualties become unsustainable. But casualties were already unsustainable. By 1943, Japan was losing pilots faster than training programs could replace them. The average Zero pilot experience dropped from 500 hours in 1942 to 200 hours in 1943. Less experience meant slower reactions, meant more deaths in fuel fires, because inexperienced pilots didn't execute the 2-second bailout fast enough. By 1944, average experience was 100 hours. By 1945, 50 hours. These pilots had no chance. They didn't know the fuel system would burn. They didn't know they had 4 seconds to live. They died confused, trying to fight the fire, trying to save the aircraft, not understanding that the aircraft was already unsavable and they were already dead. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, watched this deterioration firsthand. He described it in his post-war memoir. In 1942, my wingmen were experienced pilots with 600 hours who understood the fuel system vulnerability. When hit, they'd bail immediately. Maybe half survived. By 1944, my wingmen had 80 hours and didn't understand. They'd try to fight the fire, try to land, try to save the aircraft. They'd waste their 4 seconds trying to solve a problem that had no solution. I watched 17 wingmen die this way. Everyone died because they didn't understand Horikoshi's choice. They didn't know they were flying option 3. They didn't know option 3 meant death in 4 seconds. Nobody told them. We just sent them up to die. The worst part was that Horikoshi knew this was happening. He maintained detailed casualty records throughout the war. His personal papers, recovered after the war, include monthly spreadsheets tracking Zero losses by cause. The spreadsheets show he was documenting the exact death toll his design was causing. By December 1943, his spreadsheets showed 2,847 confirmed pilot deaths from fuel system fires. He was tracking toward his predicted 8,000, and production continued. He kept designing, kept building, kept watching the death toll climb. Because stopping production meant Japan lost immediately. Continuing production meant Japan might lose eventually, but at least had a chance. In August 1945, the war ended. Total Zero production, 10,939 aircraft. Total Zero pilots killed, approximately 8,200. Total Zero pilot deaths from fuel system fires, approximately 8,000. Horikoshi's November 1937 calculation was accurate to within 3%. He'd predicted 7,000 to 9,000 fire deaths. Reality was 8,000. He'd calculated that 85% of pilots hit in the fuel system would die. Reality was 85%. He'd estimated pilots would survive 4 to 8 seconds after fuel ignition. Reality was 6 seconds average. Every number in his 1937 calculation proved correct. The only number that was wrong was the war duration. Horikoshi calculated for 3 years. The war lasted 4 years. But the death rate per year matched his projections almost exactly. 2,000 fire deaths per year times 4 years equals 8,000 total. The math worked perfectly. After the war, Horikoshi was asked repeatedly about his 3 choices in 1937. Why did he recommend option 3? Why did he choose death over protection? His answers evolved over decades, but the core logic remained. Option 1 with 800 miles meant Japan couldn't execute carrier operations. Option 2 with 980 miles meant marginal capability with high operational risk. Option 3 with 1,200 miles meant full capability with high pilot casualties. I recommended Option 3 because strategic incapability meant certain defeat while high casualties meant possible victory. The Navy chose possible victory over certain defeat. 8,000 pilots died because we chose possibility over certainty. The question journalists never asked, but should have, was simpler. What if you'd been wrong about the war duration? What if Japan had won in 6 months like planned? Horikoshi's 3 choices would look completely different. Option 3 would have given Japan 6 months of carrier dominance with maybe 300 pilot deaths from fuel fires. The war ends. Japan wins. Most pilots survive because 6 months isn't enough time for most to experience fuel system hits. Horikoshi looks like a genius. His calculated risk paid off. He sacrificed protection for range, won the war quickly, and saved thousands of pilots who would have died in a long war regardless of what aircraft they flew. But Japan didn't win in 6 months. The war lasted 45 months. The calculated risk became a certainty. The 8,000 projected deaths became 8,000 real deaths. Horikoshi's 3 choices in 1937 weren't wrong in the short term. They were catastrophically wrong in the long term. But nobody in November 1937 knew which term would apply. They made a choice based on a 6-month assumption. Reality gave them a 45-month war, and 8,000 pilots burned because the assumption was wrong. The final irony is that by 1944, the strategic justification for Option 3 had completely evaporated. Japan no longer needed 1,200-mile range. The carrier fleet was destroyed. Remaining Zeros operated from land bases. Land-based fighters don't need carrier-compatible range. They need protection because they're flying over enemy-controlled territory where bailout means capture or death. By 1944, Option 1 with 800 miles and full protection would have been perfect for Japan's actual strategic situation. But Japan was stuck with Option 3 because changing designs mid-war was impossible. They'd chosen in 1937. They were locked in until 1945. In his final interview before his death in 1982, Horikoshi was asked one last time about his 3 choices. The interviewer asked, "If you could go back to November 1937 with the knowledge that the war would last 45 months, would you still recommend Option 3? Horikoshi thought for nearly 2 minutes before answering. His response, "If I knew the war would last 45 months, I would recommend Japan not start the war at all. But if the war is happening regardless, and I must choose between 3 aircraft designs, I would still choose Option 3, because even in a 45-month war, the alternative is worse. Option 1 means Japan loses carrier capability in month 1. Option 2 means marginal capability that fails under stress. Option 3 means full capability for as long as pilots remain alive. The 8,000 who died in Option 3 aircraft at least died in aircraft that gave Japan a chance. The alternative was all of them dying in aircraft that gave Japan no chance. I chose death with possibility over death with certainty." That was Horikoshi's final answer. He chose death. He knew he was choosing death. He calculated how many would die. He wrote it down. He recommended it anyway. Because the alternative wasn't life. The alternative was different death. And he chose the death that came with 1,200 miles of range over the death that came with 800 miles of limitation. 8,000 pilots paid for that choice, 4 seconds at a time. burning in cockpits of the best fighter aircraft in the world. Because in November 1937, one engineer had three choices, and he chose the one that turned the best fighter in the world into a flying coffin that killed its pilots faster than they could escape. Horikoshi had three choices in 1937. He chose option 3. He chose 1,200 miles. He chose death. And 8,000 pilots burned because one man in one conference room in 1 month in 1937 decided that 400 extra miles was worth 8,000 lives. That was the calculation. That was the choice. That was the cost. And every pilot who died, counting 4 seconds while their cockpit filled with fire, died because of a decision made 8 years earlier by an engineer who knew exactly what his choice would cost and chose it anyway.